Hi, I'm Fran Maier, and welcome to another session of the Napa 2020 Summer Conference. Our guests today are Trent. He's a staff apologist for Catholic Answers National Apostolate, an adjunct professor at Holy Apostles College, a frequent public lecturer and radio guest, the author of 9 books and numerous articles on Catholic faith and life, and the creator of his own popular podcast, The Council of Trent. Catherine Ruth Pakaluk is an assistant professor of social research and economic thought at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. Her main areas of research include economics of education and religion, family studies, demography, political economy, and Catholic social thought. Dr. Pakaluk is a 2015 winner of the Acton Institute's Novak Award for significant contributions to the study of the relationship between religion and economic liberty, and all of that is the easy part. She's also a wife and the mother of 8. Trent and Catherine, welcome, and thanks for being part of the Napa Institute conference this year. The point of our conversation today is the book you've written together, Can a Catholic Be a Socialist? The answer is no, and here's why. Published this past February by Catholic Answers Press. So the obvious question is, what led you to write the book, and why now? And maybe we can start with you, Trent.
Sure. About 2 years ago, I was approached by supporters of Catholic Answers saying that they felt that socialism was becoming more of a reality amongst people, or at least support for socialism was becoming a reality, especially among young people, people in my age bracket, or millennials, especially since the Great Recession in 2008. And so I felt it was important that even many solid Catholics were embracing this ideology online, sharing essays and articles about it. And so I felt it would be necessary to re-articulate the Church's teaching on socialism, but in a way that ties all the elements from theology, philosophy, economics, and history together into one accessible approach. And I knew I couldn't do it on my own. I wanted to have someone on board who was both an expert in economics and also understood Catholic social teaching. So those same supporters directed me to Catherine, and I was very impressed with her work, especially her work on the Leonine encyclicals and what they teach on socialism. And so the collaboration worked out very well, and I think the book has been very helpful in addressing this, because many people treat it as just, kind of a dead issue. Well, the Church has condemned socialism, just move on. But there are many people out there who will try to twist what these magisterial documents say and try to still argue for this position, and that's why I think the book was quite necessary.
Why did the project appeal to you, Catherine?
Yeah, I would kind of echo what Trent said, although we didn't know each other at the time. As a younger economist, I was often approached to speak on issues related to political economy. As I started studying and writing about the Leonine popes, I felt increasingly very strongly about the issues, discovering in the writings of the popes all kinds of things that I thought that people didn't know. But as a younger economist, I thought, well, I'm more interested in, and I'm more focused on things like, the fundamental relationship of the family to the economy and economic life, to education. And I thought, it's not my issue. Socialism isn't my issue, find someone else. But in the last 5 or 6, maybe 10 years, I've been increasingly worried about the kinds of things we've seen amongst our intellectual peers and friends and our allies. And so when Trent did approach me, I thought, it's okay. It can be my issue now. I'm willing to do this because I'm worried enough about what I'm seeing.
Yeah, as we mentioned earlier before the conversation today by email, socialism and Christianity are words that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So when you're talking about socialism, what are the key defining qualities that you would highlight, that you do highlight in the book, and that you think of when you're talking to other people? Maybe you can answer that one, Catherine, and then we'll go to Trent.
Sure. I like to focus on a couple of things, maybe 2 in particular, which keep us in the focus of the Leonine popes. If you were to ask Pope Leo, he would have said, well, certainly at the top of the list is the abolishment of private property, right? The abolition of private property. And the other feature that we think of as being kind of classical socialism is the command control, or the government control of the means of production, which kind of is it's a fancy sounding phrase that really refers to sort of the government orchestration of business life, right? And that can take many forms besides the government having title to businesses and enterprises. So we'll say sort of the government directed command control of various kinds of productive enterprise, and the sort of progressive, either step by step or wholesale abolition of private property.
Trent, what about you? I mean, what drew you to the subject, and what are the things that you would identify as the key elements?
Well, what drew me to the subject was just a common misunderstanding of what socialism is. And Catherine has ably articulated what is the correct definition, what you'll see in encyclopedias of economics, for example. We also tried very hard in the book to talk about what socialism is not, because many people will make this fallacious argument. Well, social welfare programs are good, and socialism is just providing social welfare programs, therefore socialism must be good. Of course, the error in that argument is that socialism is not social welfare programs. A capitalist economy can allow for various entitlement programs. As I said in my debate with Sam Rocha on socialism, socialism is not about what government does for you per se, but it's more about what government allows you to do. Will government allow you or a group of individuals to own a company, to retain profits, to reinvest in your company, to maintain it and have it, and to not have the government just be able to seize it at their own whim? So I think that's an important element. And then also what we broach in the book is people try to morph socialism into democratic socialism, but just democratically voting for an evil doesn't make it good. At the bare minimum, some people will say democratic socialism is, well, workers should have ownership in the companies they work for. And that's allowed under capitalism. You can freely organize in that way. But it goes too far when people want to impose one particular business style on all businesses. That's just not conducive to the common good.
It seems to me, too, that by using language like democratic socialism, which of course was Bernie Sanders' big pitch, that somehow you defang the essence of socialism from being criticized in debate. I wonder if you've run into that.
Well, we certainly have. It's as if people think that, we're not taught. It's the problem arises when people think that what is wrong about socialism is its totalitarianism. So they will say, well, socialism was bad in the Soviet Union or China or Cuba because it's totalitarian. But if you just had a peaceful kind of socialism, then that's something the church can support. But as we show in the book, the church has always opposed socialism, not because of its totalitarianism, but because it violates the rights of private property, subsidiarity, the foundational element of the family being the foundational element of society rather than the state. Now, socialism leading to totalitarianism is one reason that the church has opposed it. So the other problem with this argument is that it imagines a possible world that really is impossible. In order for socialism to work, as Catherine said, for commanding and planning economies, the government would have to regulate so many exchanges that it would eventually have totalitarian control over people. As we document in the book, in Cuba, for example, to regulate markets there, if you illegally sell chickens or eggs, you can go to prison for 20 years. So it invariably leads to totalitarianism, as much as critics try to say that you can have a way that doesn't.
Catherine, you deal with students, I'm sure, who would say to you, well, look, the Acts of the Apostles, the early Christian community shared things in common. I mean, what's the difference between what we're talking about as socialism and something that's already in Scripture? How do you answer?
I mean, I think there's a lot of careful scriptural history that can be done, and actually, I want to refer to some of Trent's earlier books, which do a great job with this. But I mean, I think the simplest answer is kind of, the kinds of things that Christian communities from the beginning of time have undertaken voluntarily to pursue more aggressively, more rigorously the life that Jesus lived, right? The giving up voluntarily of one's property and one's goods, which is we've understood to be a path to holiness. That's something that is praiseworthy among groups of Christians, but not necessarily the sort of thing that should be mandated by the state for all people. In other words, there's certain higher path that some of us may follow, but it isn't the ordinary path, right? Giving up marriage is a higher path for some people, but it isn't the ordinary path to say, well, because chastity is a higher calling for some people, that all people should give up marriage, right? I mean, that would be very strange and bizarre, and in fact, not God's plan.
And we wouldn't all, we wouldn't last very long if that was
No, we wouldn't.
Another point to raise to that is when we look at the early church, there was communal charity and sharing,
Mhm.
but there wasn't a mandatory collection of all property.
Right.
This is evident in Paul's letter to the Corinthians. In 2 Corinthians 9, 6 through 7, Paul appeals to the Corinthians asking for a collection to help the church. But he doesn't mandate it. In fact, if they really practiced communism, Paul wouldn't have to do that because all Christian funds would be centrally allocated and collected for the apostles to distribute. Instead, in 2 Corinthians 9, 6 through 7, Paul says, I appeal to your generosity because God loves a cheerful giver.
Mhm.
I have another question for you, Catherine, that builds on this.
Yeah.
I mean, being rational is good, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you have a rationally organized command economy, wouldn't that logically be superior to kind of a loosey-goosey open market, free market type economy? I mean, there seems to be a certain logic to that kind of an argument. Why doesn't that work?
It's the simple answer is it's too much information,
Mhm.
that we don't have all of that information. I think when you start to look at things, I mean, frankly, the best lesson we've had for this recently is kind of what's taken place during the mandated cessation of economic activity that took place during the lockdowns after the beginning of the COVID pandemic. Just in the sense that local and state governments became quite overwhelmed with the number of things they had to sort of decide to allow or disallow. I mean, we hardly know all of the different things that are operating at any given moment, let alone the kinds of things we need to know to decide what prices things should trade at. So it's a longer explanation, but the simple answer is we don't know all the information that we should have to rationally control things, which is not to say we give up on, creating rational boundaries for things or learning as we go. Well, gee, it doesn't work out very well if we allow these sorts of trades to happen without, say, adequate representation. What kinds of trades? Say, certain kinds of labor trades. Sometimes people need representation. They need other people to look out for their interests. And I'm now referring, of course, to the early kinds of regulations that came into place in the beginning of the sort of modern economy. So we don't operate in any kind of laissez-faire situation. But the idea that you could, in a forward-looking way, decide how all these sorts of trades should take place so that distribution happens. Of course, that's the goal. We want the good things of the earth to be widely distributed and enjoyed by people. But the other maybe cheap answer to your question is that it never works. We haven't managed it, right? So that every time we try this sort of very rational idea, which is appealing, it doesn't work. So I think what's interesting is to figure out why it's the case that the gift of rationality that we have is meant to be used by us in a series of cooperative exchanges in which we are very much using our rational energies, but we are not, any one of us, planning the economic activity of hundreds of thousands of others of us.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I think what I would add to that is that the premise that, well, an economy should be rationally organized, I would say I wholeheartedly agree with that. But it doesn't entail from that premise that an economy therefore should be organized by bureaucrats or some government officials at the very top. That what makes an economy organized is actually the spontaneous interactions between the millions of producers and consumers within it, as Catherine was alluding to. This is the problem of knowledge that Friedrich Hayek noted back in the 1940s, that knowing what things cost, how available they are, no one has access to that knowledge, but individuals, when they set prices voluntarily, can create signals to encourage proper distribution and flow within supply chains, within consumers purchasing things. And as you can rationally organize it, not at the top down, but from the bottom up. It's the same way that a flock of birds is not led by one conductor bird that tells all the other birds where to go. A flock of birds is rationally organized, but every member within the flock sends out a signal to the other birds around him or her to tell where he's going. And then the flock moves as a whole while being rationally organized by the members within it. And that's the model we think for economics that makes more sense than trying to command and control it from the top, which, as we show in the book, it just never works. It ends in shortages and human misery.
And Venezuela.
Yeah.
Yes,
The things.
they try. They try to think that it can be done. Not just also the lack of knowledge, but there's the lack of incentive. That when Venezuela nationalized their domestic food production, they ended up, the food production plummeted, because when the government subsidizes your work and you will get paid no matter how much you produce, it was the same thing in the Soviet Union. You don't work as hard if you're not in competition with others. And so ironically, in trying to produce more food for the country, Venezuela ended up having to import food that it once was able to produce domestically, and then later ended up conscripting people to work in farms against their will. So the pattern repeats itself over and over again.
Yeah. And
I'm
really
sorry.
quickly, there's a delightful passage in one of Hayek's early essays on this, where it's very clear that the early 20th century economists, looking at the development of modern economies, they were really quite delighted to discover how many people these sort of free economies could support. We take this for granted. They looked around, they said, it's marvelous. We had no idea how many people. I mean, to Trent's point, and although you try in this sort of planned way to increase your food production, you get less, right? And these early economists looked around and said, this is marvelous. Like, we're feeding all of London, I mean, but we might do better to have a little bit more just appreciation for what we've managed to do in the number of people who are supported. And this, you asked about my students. I mean, this is one of the things I constantly try to remind them of, the many millions of things they take for granted that have been produced for them, not by any particular one person's knowledge, but by this cooperation that's taken place.
And that's one of the functions of loss of
Remarkable.
memory, loss of history.
Yes.
They have no experience of shortages, war, or anything else. That's an alarming development in American culture. Catherine, I've got a question for you that, I mean, you work in a daily in a Catholic environment at a Catholic university. I mean, why in purely spiritual terms would a competitive economy actually be better spiritually for people than in a command economy, a planned economy? I mean, how do you get to the point where you're actually freer spiritually and internally in a competitive market economy? That doesn't on the surface, that doesn't seem to make sense.
Yeah. So I think that this is, so you've raised a really, fascinating fact about the kind of paradox of human life, that this shows up all over the place, right? That the structure of the human person, the structure of freedom as God planned it for us, is one in which our freedom is in fact enlarged and glorified in a certain way by our taking on more responsibilities that are the kinds of responsibilities that God asks free and responsible people to take on. So in fact, my freedom as a woman is not restricted by the fact that God blessed me with 8 children, but it's grown and it's enlarged, and my capacity to love is enlarged. And this is true. This is the structure of the person, the structure of, I mean, it's paradoxical. It sort of surprises us. I'm not most myself when I have nothing to do and no one depends upon me. But this truth about the family and the person is also true in economic life, that we are, in fact, made by God to be workers in the vineyard. And so we are better off when more things depend upon us. So that my business depends upon me. Other people that I work with depend upon me. They depend upon not just, my productivity in some economic sense, but upon my cheerfulness and my generosity and my goodness at work. And those things simply cannot be distributed. They can't be bought and they can't be distributed, right? And that is, it's like many other parts of the mystery of human life, that this is why the spiritual qualities of our relationships with each other are enhanced when in fact we are pressed by our circumstances to become better than we are. Yeah.
Trent, what would you add to that?
Well, I would just agree that this idea that economies should treat everyone as equals is correct, in the sense that we should be treated as having equal dignity, equal standing before the law. But it's an error to treat us all as equals in every respect, because we are not equals. As Pope Leo XIII rightly pointed out, we are unequal in talents, abilities, fortunes, drive, determination, passions, and interests. And because of those inequalities, the best way to respect those inequalities we have is to allow people to have the freedom to pursue them according to their place and stature in life, while making sure that nobody becomes destitute as a result of some kind of inequality. But by respecting that, as Catherine said, we create a genuine human interdependence among one another. Otherwise, if you have a command and control economy where government provides for everyone and does everything for everyone, then you turn into Cain and Abel a little bit. Am I my brother's keeper? It's not my job to care for this person and do this. That somebody else takes care of all of that. So I think it's far more spiritually conducive when we recognize human equality and our dignity, but the inequality that exists in more instrumental aspects of our personalities that can be put towards the good.
Yes, I think one of the points that my former boss, Archbishop Chaput, used to make all the time was that if you're created uniquely and loved uniquely, the idea of an egalitarian sense of equality goes out the window. It's not possible. You have to be equal before the law. You have to be equal in basic dignity. But it's like saying that I love all of my kids equally. That's simply not true. I love them uniquely, and it's a very different sense. The Christian sense of equality is what I've drawn from your text and also from your comments. The Christian sense of equality is real, but it's not the same definition as secular, egalitarian, political equality. They're not really the same creatures. I've got one more question before we close, and I'd like to ask this of both of you. If you had 2 or 3 lessons that you'd want the reader to draw from your book, what would you think would be the key 2 or 3 elements? Catherine, why don't we start with you?
Okay, key 2 or 3. I think the first one would be knowledge of history a little bit. I think you talked about the purging of memory. We've got the knowledge of history, these chapters which kind of go over in a very quick way. I even, one of my longtime students who was reading some early drafts, kept looking up from the drafts and said, wait, really? Did this happen? I didn't know that this happened. We cannot take for granted that people know these things. So I would say a little bit of a review. And so any particular chapter about these, and I'm going to use the word, these bloodstained chapters in the history of socialism, that any particular chapter, we actually cite lots of different great sources and so interested readers could move on from those chapters. So I would say that, and then to complement that, also kind of the reality of what the church has taught about socialism. The early popes, the Leonine popes in particular, who were facing this very direct attacks from socialism, they did not pull punches, and the kinds of language that they used about socialism, it's not faint. They were quite critical. And again, I think we've kind of softened a lot of that. Part of that is some sort of understandable, and part of it I think is to be blamed. We should blame some of the softening of that kind of language. So I guess those are the 2 things for me, like sort of the history and then the history of what the popes have actually taught. I'd like to say I'd love our readers to gain like a first-class principles of economics course out of our book. And I don't think they get there, but I think they might get, maybe a quarter. I think they might get 25% of that. So that'd be okay.
Trent?
Yes, no, I think that our main thesis, what's interesting is that criticisms of the book have tended to focus on goals we did not set out to do, such as a complete explication of Catholic economics or a full-scale description of capitalism from a Catholic perspective, which we simply never sought to do. Our goal was to show socialism is incompatible with the Catholic faith. So I'd want people to, reading the book, keep their eye on that particular thesis that we ably substantiate. When it comes to talking about economic matters from a Catholic perspective, I would say that you have to remember that economics is a science, and that economics cannot be done by good intentions alone. I think that many people who are in favor of socialism, it is not out of malice, it is out of ignorance. And there's an idea that here's a policy and it should work because I have good intentions behind this policy. But as we show in the book, many accounts of human misery can be created simply because of good intentions that don't correspond to reality. So I think the last lesson both of us would want people to take away from the book is that when they examine any moral issue, but especially this one, they should remember the words of Pope Leo XIII, which is that we ought to look at reality as it really is. We should look at the world as it really is, not what we wish it was, not what we hope it would be, but as it really is, and work through that real experience towards spiritual regeneration and building up the kingdom of God in a realistic way that strays between pessimism and hapless utopianism.
Yeah, I was just reading Richard Weaver recently, and of course he has that great line, ideas have consequences. All you need to do is look at the consequences of the idea of socialism, and it's extremely sobering. One thing I do want to say before we close is that I think you've done an absolutely comprehensive job in your work. It's but not just comprehensive. A lot of people can be comprehensive and completely misunderstood or unreadable. You've done a really wonderful job in presenting a very important topic comprehensively and very readably. So I really encourage people who see this conversation we've had to get the book. And to that end, the book is Catholic. Can a Catholic be a socialist? The answer is no, and here's why. It's published by Catholic Answers Press, and it's available on Amazon, but also directly from Catholic Answers at www.catholic.com. So, Catherine and Trent, thanks so very much for doing this. It's been wonderful talking with you, and I'm sure the people who see this will be really enriched by your conversation. Great.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Fran. Thank you.